"That's impossible," I said, staring at my phone with feigned surprise as Brandon's sister ranted about the rent money he'd promised her and then disappeared. He did what I kept my voice calm, letting her believe I was just learning about my husband's betrayal. "My name is EA Thompson, and my husband, Brandon, just officially became the biggest mistake of my life, but not in the way he thinks." That Sunday morning, when I woke up to an empty bed and a cold note stuck to the fridge, it felt like a slap across the face. Though, truthfully, I'd been expecting it for a while. "Goodbye. Never loved you anyway." Classic Brandon, cruel and cowardly. I'm a forensic accountant in Milwaukee with 15 years of experience tracking financial fraud for some of the biggest corporations in the Midwest. So, when my husband started showing signs of plotting his grand escape 3 months ago, let's just say he wasn't exactly up against an amateur. The first red flag was when he started asking about our retirement accounts. Sudden interest after years of letting me handle every single financial decision. Then came the secret phone calls, the unexplained absences, and the way his computer screen would always change whenever I walked into the room. Classic signs of someone preparing to vanish. I'd seen it hundreds of times before. What Brandon never realized was that every suspicious transaction, every hidden purchase, every attempt to quietly transfer our money, I saw it all. Every step he took to try and rob me blind was documented, photographed, and sent directly to my lawyer. By the time he left that note, thinking he'd pulled off the perfect getaway, I had already moved our savings, locked down our accounts, and planned for every move he might try. So, when the fraud alerts started flooding my phone on Monday morning, I couldn't help but smile. Brandon thought he was 10 steps ahead, but he had no idea he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, declined transactions, failed withdrawals, frozen accounts. Each one was music to my ears. My fingers brushed against the thick folder labelled "Just in Case" sitting on my desk. A folder filled with months of evidence that would not only destroy his escape plan, but his entire future. As I listened to his sister's frantic voice on the phone, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You might think I was devastated when I found out my husband of 8 years never really loved me. But here's the thing about being a forensic accountant: you learn to spot patterns. People think they're clever when they're hiding things, but money always leaves a trail. Always. And Brandon. He left breadcrumbs everywhere. I met Brandon at a charity gala 6 years ago. He was charming, successful, or at least that's how he presented himself, and seemed serious about his future. He worked as an investment advisor, drove a fancy car, and talked about building a life together. I was impressed by his confidence and ambition. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the way he always deflected questions about his clients and how vague he was about his past. The first 3 years were good, or at least I thought so. We bought a beautiful house in the Milwaukee suburbs, planned extravagant vacations, and even started discussing having kids. But there were always little things that didn't quite add up, like how defensive he got when I asked about his student loans, or how he changed the subject whenever I mentioned meeting his old colleagues. "You don't trust me," he'd say, flipping the conversation back on me. "Why do you need to know everything? Don't you think I can handle my own finances?" Classic manipulation. I'd seen it countless times in my job, people using emotional guilt to avoid financial transparency. But I let it go because I wanted to believe in us, in him. That was my first mistake. Then came the signs I couldn't ignore. Last Christmas, he insisted we each have separate accounts for holiday shopping. "It'll be more romantic if we surprise each other," he said. But I noticed the credit card statements he thought he'd hidden. showing purchases from high-end jewelry stores, jewelry I never received, weekend business trips that didn't match any conference schedules I could find, mystery phone calls from numbers that always went to voicemail if I was around. Most wives would have confronted their husbands immediately. I didn't. Instead, I pulled bank statements, tracked transactions, and quietly built a case. Every time he thought he was covering his tracks, he was actually giving me more evidence. I watched as he slowly siphoned money from our accounts, thinking I had no idea. Working late again, he asked one night, pretending to be concerned while I sat at my laptop. "Just catching up on some cases," I replied, without mentioning that the case I was working on was him. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. I was working late, actually working this time, when my co-worker Susan came rushing to my desk, her face pale and clutching her phone like it might explode. "Isla, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. I was reviewing the Thompson case files when I found something. It was about Brandon. My stomach dropped as I looked at her screen. There it was, Brandon's name linked to a series of suspicious transactions we were investigating, not as a witness, not as a victim, as a primary suspect. The same patterns I'd been tracking in our personal accounts were appearing in his professional work. He wasn't just leaving me, he was running from something much bigger. "There's more," Susan whispered, scrolling through the files. "He's been named in 3 other fraud investigations. Different states, different aliases, but the same playbook. He finds successful women, marries them, then disappears with their money. The last case was in Phoenix right before he moved to Milwaukee. The puzzle pieces started falling into place, the charm, the secrecy, the sudden interest in our money. It was all part of his routine. I wasn't his wife, I was his next mark. And he had no idea that this time his target was someone who made a living catching men exactly like him." That night, I sat in our kitchen until dawn, revisiting every memory with fresh eyes. The loving husband act, the careful manipulation, the way he slowly tried to isolate me from my friends and family. It was all so painfully clear. I found myself laughing, not because any of it was funny, but because of the sheer irony of it all. He'd picked the wrong woman to con. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Every morning I kissed him goodbye like nothing had changed. Every night I listened to his lies about work while I documented every suspicious transaction. I moved our savings, contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and gathered evidence to not only protect myself, but help his previous victims. "You seem different lately," he said one night, studying my face. "Is everything okay?" I smiled, thinking about the trap I'd set, about how his own arrogance would be his downfall. "Just tired from work," I replied. "You know how this time of year gets." He nodded sympathetically, probably thinking I was just overworked, making more money for him to steal. If he'd paid more attention, he might have noticed the gleam in my eye, the one that said I knew exactly what he was doing. But con men like Brandon never think they'll be the ones getting played. And that's the thing about people who make a living out of betraying others. They never expect to be the ones being betrayed. The morning after Brandon disappeared, his grand plan began unfolding, but not quite the way he expected. The first call came from our bank. Flagged transactions, multiple failed withdrawal attempts, credit cards maxed out. The second call was from his sister Kelly, her voice shrill with panic about the money Brandon had borrowed from her. The third call, however, was the real showstopper, a woman named Rachel Clark from Phoenix, calmly asking if I knew where her husband was. Her husband. The word hit me like a cold slap. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked, gripping my phone tighter as I slid into a chair at the kitchen table. "Brandon Murphy," she said, her voice tightly controlled, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "He's still legally my husband. He disappeared with my savings 3 years ago. I've been following him ever since. I couldn't stop the smile that crept onto my face. Funny enough, here he's known as Brandon Thompson, and you're not going to believe this, but I've actually been waiting for your call. Over the next hour, Rachel and I compared notes. Same charming smile, same slick story about being an investment advisor, same pattern: win the woman's trust, slowly drain her accounts, then disappear. But this time, there was one key difference. Mister, I've been building a case against him for months, I told her, but if we want to take him down properly, I'll need your help. Right on cue, my phone lit up with a text from Brandon. I'm sorry, can we talk one last time? Perfect. He was following the same script Rachel had described, disappearing, letting panic set in, then reaching out for one last chance to manipulate his way into any money I might still have access to. I forwarded the message to my lawyer, who was already working on the next step. Let's spring the trap, she said, eyes gleaming. I agreed to meet Brandon at a quiet cafe downtown. When I walked in, he was already there, disheveled, just enough to look pitiful, his eyes red like he hadn't slept, clothes slightly wrinkled, the image of a man who'd made a terrible mistake and was desperate to fix it. Issa, he started, voice thick with faux remorse. I'm so sorry. He reached for my hand across the table. I've been going through a lot, some bad investments. I panicked. I pulled my hand back, playing my part to perfection. How bad is it, Brandon? His eyes flickered, just for a second, hope. He thought I was buying it. About $200,000, he admitted, shoulders slumping, but I can fix it if I can just get access to our emergency fund. I let silence hang between us, watching him squirm under my gaze. The emergency fund, I said slowly. You mean the one you tried to drain yesterday? The colour drained from his face just for a moment before he forced a smile. That was a misunderstanding. I wasn't thinking clearly, but if you help me now, I promise. To do what? I interrupted. Disappear again? Or maybe stick around just long enough to empty my accounts like you did to Rachel in Phoenix? He paled visibly. For the first time since I met him, Brandon Thompson, or Murphy, or whatever his real name was, looked genuinely shocked. You know, I continued, sliding a thick folder across the table, if you'd done just a little more homework, you might have realized that trying to scam a forensic accountant wasn't your brightest idea. Before he could respond, 2 FBI agents approached the table. I stood, smoothing out my jacket. Oh, and Brandon? I smiled. You might want to invest in a good lawyer. The agents escorted him out, his bravado crumbling with every step. Through the cafe window, I watched as they guided him into a waiting federal vehicle. The confident, charming man I'd once married had shrunk into a pathetic con artist whose games were finally over. My phone buzzed. It was Susan, my colleague and fellow forensic accountant. Her timing was impeccable. We've got him, she said, barely containing her excitement. We just finished tracing those offshore accounts you flagged. Brandon wasn't just running a marriage scam. He's at the center of a massive Ponzi scheme. We're talking millions. Millions. I shouldn't have been surprised, but still, the sheer scale took my breath away. How many victims? I asked, already knowing the answer would make me sick. 23 confirmed so far, Susan replied. Across 5 states, 12 marriages, all to successful, financially stable women. She paused, then added, and we found evidence he was gearing up for something even bigger. He was setting up a new investment firm. He was going to use your credentials and reputation to target high net worth clients. I felt a strange mix of anger and vindication. All those times he asked me about my cases, about the wealthy families I audited. He wasn't interested in my work. He was studying my world, planning to leverage my career for his biggest con yet. The irony, I said quietly, is that if he'd stuck to his usual routine, he might have gotten away with it again. But his greed got the better of him. And that's not even the best part, Susan said, her tone shifting to pure satisfaction. Remember how he insisted on that country club membership last year? Turns out he was using it to scout his next mark, Caroline Mitchell, the hedge fund manager. My stomach clenched. Caroline. Not just a random target. One of my closest friends. He was setting her up to be his next wife, Susan said. But Caroline's been working with us the whole time. She recorded every interaction, forwarded every email, saved every text. I shook my head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. He really thought he could con Caroline. Oh, he didn't just think it, Susan laughed. He gave her the full pitch. And while he thought he was grooming his next victim, she was feeding us a step-by-step map of his operation. I couldn't help but laugh too. Brandon, who prided himself on always being the smartest man in the room, had unknowingly been surrounded by women who were 10 steps ahead the entire time. "Have you heard from Kelly?" I asked, thinking back to his sister's frantic call that morning. "That's another fun twist," Susan said. "She's not his sister, she's his accomplice. They've been running this con together for years. Her job was to play the panicked sibling, needing quick cash right before he disappeared." My grip tightened around the phone. "Where is she now?" "Chicago PD picked her up about an hour ago," Susan said. "They're already working on flipping her. She's got a long history of priors. She'll crack." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed but also exhilarated. Brandon's empire of lies had collapsed in spectacular fashion, but his fatal flaw had been his own arrogance. He never saw it coming. "One last thing," Susan added, her voice turning serious. "We got his real identity. His name's not Brandon Thompson or Murphy. It's Brandon Roberts. And he's been wanted for fraud in Canada since 2015. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. "Well," I said, "Brandon Roberts, welcome to your new reality." I was about to leave the cafe when my phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. "You think you're clever, but you have no idea what's coming. Check your email." The email contained a folder of photos, me, my family, my daily routines, even shots taken through my living room window. A chill ran through me, not fear, but fury. Brandon had hired someone to follow me. I forwarded everything to Susan and my lawyer, then dialed Agent Morrison, the FBI lead on the case. "Agent Morrison, we've got a new player." "We're already tracking him," Morrison said. The photos were sent from an IP tied to James Foster, Brandon's former cellmate from Phoenix. He's been Brandon's muscle for years, threatening anyone who got too close. I thought of Rachel Clark, wondering if threats were why she waited so long to speak up. "Where's Foster now?" I asked. "That's the problem," Morrison said. "We can't find him." After the sentencing, Agent Morrison approached me with a warm smile, her hands tucked casually into her jacket pockets. "The Bureau could really use someone like you," she said. "Have you ever considered consulting for us?" I thought about it for a moment, not just about Brandon, but about all the other Brandons out there. The charming liars, the smooth-talking predators who thought they were too clever, too careful, too untouchable. "You know what?" I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I think I'd like that." As I stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp Milwaukee sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in years. Brandon thought he'd broken me, thought he'd reduced me to nothing more than a stepping stone on his path to easy wealth. Instead, he'd forged something stronger. And now, I had a new purpose, making sure Brandon Roberts would be the last con man foolish enough to underestimate a woman with a mind for numbers and a taste for justice. 6 months after Brandon's sentencing, I stood at the front of a packed conference room at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Milwaukee. The air buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional click of pens against notepads as agents, analysts, and investigators settled into their seats. Behind me, a screen displayed a timeline labelled The Thompson Case, though we all knew that wasn't his real name. It wasn't mine either. I'd reclaimed my maiden name within days of his arrest, severing even the smallest legal tie to his legacy. I wanted nothing to do with any of his lies, not even the name he'd used to trap me. The modern con artist doesn't need a gun, I began, my voice clear and confident. They rely on something much more dangerous, trust. They use charm, manipulation, and technology to craft their stories. But no matter how clever they think they are, they all leave a trail. You just have to know where to look. I moved through the presentation, breaking down the tactics Brandon and his accomplices had used, not just the scams themselves, but the psychological manipulation that made them so effective. The emotional hooks, the calculated plays for sympathy, the slow, methodical isolation of their victims from family and friends. The program I'd developed with the FBI was already making waves. In just the past month, we'd helped uncover and dismantle 3 major romance scam networks operating across state lines. Each time we shut one down, we found the same patterns: vulnerable women, isolated by charm and lies, convinced to hand over their savings, their homes, their futures. Rachel had become one of our most valuable assets. Her first-hand experience as one of Brandon's victims gave us insight no textbook ever could. She knew exactly how predators like him selected their targets, how they built trust, and how they slowly turned that trust into leverage. Together, we were building something that had never existed before, a network not just of investigators, but of survivors willing to fight back. After the presentation ended, I stepped aside to let the applause die down and checked my phone. There was a message from Susan, short but powerful. Another one. A new victim had been located, this time in Vancouver. Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. A whirlwind romance followed by growing financial entanglement, ending in total devastation. Unlike many of us, she hadn't managed to salvage anything. Brandon had stripped her bare, her home, her savings, her business, all gone. But this time, we had something no one else ever had: his encrypted files. It had taken months, but the FBI's forensic team had finally cracked into Brandon's deepest, darkest secrets: offshore accounts, hidden properties, shell companies he'd set up under fake names. For the first time, we had a clear map of everywhere the money had gone, and we were using it to help victims like the woman in Vancouver recover what they'd lost. I thought back to that Sunday morning, the cold silence of my house, the note stuck to the fridge with a cheap magnet. 5 cruel words meant to leave me shattered. Goodbye. Never loved you anyway. Brandon thought those words would break me. Instead, they'd given me purpose. They lit a fire that led me here, not just to my own freedom, but to the chance to help others reclaim theirs. That night, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, overlooking the dark waters of Lake Michigan. The air was cool and the city lights flickered in the distance, reflecting off the water in shimmering gold and silver streaks. Everything in my life was mine again. The home, the view, my future. None of it tainted by his lies. I smiled at the sheer irony. Brandon had spent years targeting strong, capable women, believing he could break us down, piece by piece, until we were nothing but stepping stones on his path to wealth. But all he'd really done was create something far more dangerous: a network of survivors, women who refused to stay victims, women who were turning their pain into power. We weren't just women who'd been scammed. We were women who'd fought back. Women who were now the hunters instead of the hunted. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's thriving.